comes on the screen.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. We're live. Okay. So it's not yet 7. Good evening and welcome to this session on ethics by design, structures for responsible AI. This is the 4th day of the Responsible AI for Social Empowerment Summit. So far, we have had excellent sessions throughout these 4 days, and we have had panel speakers speaking on diverse subjects related to AI, and we almost all issues related to artificial intelligence, whether it's related to research, whether it's related to applications in agriculture, skilling, education, healthcare, are being addressed. So tomorrow will be the last day for the summit. The closing will be at 7. So this session on ethics by design, structures for responsible AI, we have an excellent panel of speakers. Today, I will just briefly introduce them and then we go on to the first keynote. So we have Dr. Jassim Haji, who is the President, Artificial Intelligence Society, Bahrain. Dr. Jassim Haji has management and executive experience in aviation, hospitality, technology, and communications for over 30 years. He has been a part of the Bahrain Center of Excellence, which is overlooking excellence in the public sector. Then we have Mr. Vilas Dhar, who is the president of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. He is an entrepreneur, technologist, and human rights advocate with a lifelong commitment to creating more robust social institutions that foster shared opportunity. He also leads philanthropic vision that bridges the frontiers of artificial intelligence and data science for social good. Then we have Ms. K. Firth-Butterfield. She's the head of AI and machine learning, Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution, WEF. And she's a barrister at law and former part-time judge in the United Kingdom and a professor of law and international relations in the United States. She is also an associate fellow at the Center for Future Intelligence, University.
I think we've lost Mr. Singh. Perhaps we can get going if that's all right. What do we think? Should we go ahead?
He did introduce the speakers, so why don't we just get started with
and then we can start ourselves. That's right. So maybe we'll start with Dr. Haji. Perhaps you can start, and I think the team can the RAISE team can share the slides.
Thank you very much. Good day, everyone. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I'm calling and joining you from the land of the pearl, the middle of the Gulf. It's my
apologies. Something went wrong at this end, so I'm very sorry. So Mr. Shameek Kundu, who will be the moderator of the session today, is the Chief Data Officer of Standard Chartered Bank. He is the co-author of Monetary Authority of Singapore's Guidelines on Responsible AI. He is a member of Bank of England's Public Partnership on AI Governance and is a member of the OECD GPAI Group Working Group on Data Governance for AI. Then we have Mr. Griffin, who is the Chief Ethics Officer of Hypergiant. He is an entrepreneur and with a proven thought leader with a track record of bringing cultural shifting content and technology solutions to new platforms. At Hypergiant, he developed and evangelizes the company's ethics in AI framework and use case vetting model. We have Dr. Ravindran. He is the head of the Robert Bosch Center for Data Science and AI at IIT Madras. He is a Mindtree faculty fellow with a PhD from University of Massachusetts. His current research interests span the broader area of machine learning, ranging from spatio-temporal abstractions in reinforcement learning to social network analysis and data text mining. Then we have Mr. Keshav Dhakad, who is the legal head of Microsoft India. He provides regulatory counsel to business groups in public policy issues for Microsoft. And then we have Ms. Fernanda Vegas. She's the co-lead of Google Pair. She's a Brazilian scientist and designer who leads the big picture team, part of Google Brain. Her work in machine learning focuses on improving human-AI interaction with a broader agenda of democratizing AI technology. With Ms. Arunima Sarkar, she's the AI lead, Center for Industrial Revolution, WEF, and she leads the co-design of governance protocol and technology policy frameworks for artificial intelligence for maximum benefits to society and mitigating any unwanted outcomes, biases, and risks. So we have an excellent panel and keynote speakers. So without wasting any more time, we will go to Dr. Jassim Haji, President of Artificial Intelligence Society, Bahrain, for his keynote.
Thank you very much. Thank you. And without any ado, I will share my presentation. I will start with the social note, which nicely allows me to move into ethics of AI. Greetings from Bahrain. A few months ago in Bahrain, we've celebrated 200 years of inauguration of a first Indian temple in heart of the capital. Just shows the root of the relationships between the two countries. But we not only share cultures and history, but also technology. In many occasions, we mimic India's sample of being the hub for the world. What Bahrain is attempting to do is be the hub of artificial intelligence, research and development for the Middle East. And today, the Middle East is moving from being the consumer market to producers, to developing AI by itself, to being part of it and the design and policies related to it. And who else can understand that better than the people from the region and the people in the neighboring country, and namely, as I said, India, who we share similar cultures and visions. In Bahrain, we have the visions of His Majesty's on future digital economy and artificial intelligence, which he stressed last year upon the opening of the house. I would take this an entry point to how AI ethics, designs, and algorithm impacts the whole community. As I said, the title was, How Far is Far Enough? You could go and talk about the ethics and the policies forever, and until you have a policy for every single code or algorithm. If we look at the artificial intelligence pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, there are two different scenarios completely. So I would urge everyone to look at the artificial intelligence and its associations post the pandemic, because many things has changed, perhaps not technically, but ethically, socially, and what is related to the business. How artificial intelligence was not deeply used prior to the pandemic and got us all wrong-footed is a question that all of us should ask. With so much research in the past few years, and mostly in the commercial part and in the business, where the aim was how artificial intelligence can reduce the cost, can reduce human interactions, but little to see on the education, remote working, and the health sector, which seem to be most important than anything else. Major countries who've been leading the world also did not invest in that area, did not research. So there was a hasty reaction and research during the pandemic by February and March that started and putting hastier solutions in place. And some of those been developed to be part of the beta test. And the danger was that those been developed on the human and the real world, where it should have been done on the labs. Face recognitions, the apps, the artificial intelligence and identifying the patterns of the disease in different places and predictions on how it's going to be spread, in analysis and in forecast and in recommendations. Those are the key elements that we have been probably not focusing in key health areas. But even in drug resolution, that has been used in a different way. Now, when we talked about the ethics of the AI, I had in the past few weeks different discussions with my very good colleagues from France, United Kingdom, Malaysia, people in the AI medical sector, people in the AI research and universities. And there seems to be a lot of stress on the ethics when it comes to AI, even when it matters to the saving of the lives of the people. So there is a question, are lives not more important than the ethics? And how far do we go? Again, going back to the same questions. Are there any specific organizations, bodies, corporation who can claim that they can centralize the AI ethics worldwide, even by geographic locations? Maybe not. The example I have given right at the beginning, how countries are understanding each other culturally. What is ethical in the West and different parts of the world may not be that ethical here, in this part of the world, the Middle East or East or in Asia. And probably vice versa, what is more ethical for us is not the same in the other parts of the world. So who are we to generalize those values and ethics to the rest of the community and put a standard design for the ethics and its values? This is culturally, there has been differences. They have to collaborate, but you cannot fit it all for one. And as I said earlier, is it going to slow us down? Are we going to have a document, a review longer than the time it takes to produce a design? Is it now becoming commercially important that we stick a tag of ethics to an AI development to promote that this is more ethical than others? It is not a product, it is not a service. It is a group of people who have a great understanding of the business, of the culture, of the algorithm and the design, gather and make that decision. Should you make that decision wrong? Should you start that wrong? Should you put a bias on it? Should you put a wrong ethical values? This is the start of building it wrongly. And to fix it in future, that will take us much more efforts and more complications. I noticed IEEE's quote, which attracted me, and they have a great experience of decades on that, where they say there is a difference between AI during the design phase, during the theories and the ethical values, between those and when it's put in practice. When it is in practice, when people go deep and try it, they find many of those need to be altered, as I said earlier. Therefore, you need the practitioners being part of it right from the beginning, right from the design, with all the respect with people who are only focusing on the design issues of the ethical AI. Is this something new that we're talking about? The ethics and the fears of the AI? Is it going to be a showstopper? Is it people talking about it and then the industry is moving regardless? Or are we putting a complete collaboration to judge and value balance between the two? We all heard in the past the ethics of the internet, dark internet, when cloud computing came and the concern to the banking sectors, when the mobiles, hacking, security issues, the data privacy, which is still big issues in the West and Europe, the GDPR and others. We also see a lot of debate about the face recognition in different parts of the world. And even the latest Google, Apple APIs in countries in Europe, for instance, Great Britain, who have found it intruding the privacy, and that was not passed. Of course, there was an alternative. But shouldn't you have a proper alternative? Shouldn't you be able to do it? Then all this has to be reconsidered. You cannot have just a body to look at that part. I would like to end my slides with saying, well, even on the security and ethics, in some countries, in some regions, security is very important, the national security. Now, how do we judge that with ethical AIs? How do you control the drones, the military drones? How do you defend your network against intruders, which have been very active in the past few months, who use artificial intelligence to make most of their attacks? Because they look at your patterns, they look at the history and judge their attacks based on that. Now, if you don't be as aggressive, as rigorous in using AI to defend yourself, you will have a problem in future. You cannot use the traditional defenses against those. So in security and military, again, this is a different ethical issues and different necessities that we have to look at. With that, I am probably posing more questions than answers to you for your sessions to come. And I'm sure many of you will address those, will address the differences, the cultural, the centralization of the ethics, the unilateralizations, the time it takes. Remember that in the past we had so many policies on security, IEEE, for every new technology. But the technology is moving much faster to enable us to document all those. However, it is a concern that we need to judge. I will leave that and say, we all have those concerns. We in the Middle East are one of the biggest markets that is growing on the AI, probably bigger than any other cities. We have in our neighboring countries, one of the most modern cities built on AI and from the greenfield. And those ethical values of our cultures will be taken into consideration, plus the AI. I hope my 10 minutes or so was a value. And I thank you for listening to me and hope to collaborate more between you guys and the Kingdom of Bahrain, the future hub of AI in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Haji. And it was indeed, you have raised the right questions, right issues with regard to AI-based security issues, AI-based ethical issues. And I am sure with the kind of insights Bahrain has and the kind of relationships we have with India and Bahrain, we will be working together, collaborating with each other in the field of building ethical AI, which is responsible by design. And I'm sure the panel that we have in this session will be addressing many of the questions that you have raised. So if you can stop sharing your screen.
Sure, thank you very much for...
Yeah. So thank you. Thanks a lot, Dr. Haji. And now we move on to the next presentation by Mr. Vilas, Dhar, President of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, and Ms. K. Firth-Butterfield from the WEF.
Thank you. And touching on Dr. Haji's point, there are actually over 190 organizations that have created ethical AI principles around the world. But what we are seeing is that 10 of those are common. So we see those ethical principles again and again. But the question we are asking here, and in fact have been working on at the World Economic Forum for the last 3 years, is how do we operationalize these principles to provide everyone with a roadmap for ethical design of AI? Without good governance of AI, we can't be sure that our efforts to use it will actually benefit humanity and the planet and be successful. I'm delighted to be joined on this virtual stage by Vilas Dhar. He is a multi-sectional leader, an AI technologist, a lawyer, and now a philanthropist, also a fellow on social change at Harvard. He's president of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation, which is a billion-dollar philanthropy focused on shaping the future of AI and data solutions that make the world a better place. Welcome, Vilas.
Thank you so much, Kay. Thank you also to Prime Minister Modi, to the government of India, to METI, to Mr. Abhishek Singh for this invitation. As important as these conversations are that they happen among practitioners, it's also important that they happen in a transparent and open space with high-level support that speaks to the need for all of our populations to come together to talk about these things. I also want to acknowledge that in other times we might have been together. I know well the culture and hospitality of the Indian subcontinent. I hope we might be together again soon, but until then, I hope all are well, and thank you for participating. I'm very happy to be here with Kay. For those of you who may not know the history, Kay was one of the very first people to bring AI ethics to notice. She's now a leading voice in bringing AI ethics from idea to implementation, heading the World Economic Forum's AI team. She's a barrister, a judge. She's the first chief ethics officer of an AI company, and she's helping shaping our field for the benefit of humanity. So with that background, I'm excited to dive into this conversation today. We are going to discuss some of the work that's already happening in the field of AI ethics and transform into a conversation about what we might do together. As I said, not just as practitioners, but as an informed citizenry. So with that, Kay, will you kick us off?
Yes, well, actually, I'm going to ask you, Vilas, to kick us off. Where do we start on ethics by design in AI?
Okay, it's a good question. I've been reflecting a lot on summers that I've spent in South India through my life, gorging on as many mangoes as possible. And the reason I'm thinking of that is to remember that in order to have a really delicious and healthy mango, clean air. I'm thinking of that because in the context of ethics in AI, it's impossible to start simply by saying we should increase our use of ethics in the design of AI systems. We have to start first from the use of data to make sure that the data that's informing those systems and is guiding the decision-making algorithms is coming from a place that is ethically sourced. There are 3 considerations I think about a lot in making sure that our systems are ethically designed from start to finish. The first is to think about consent, to make sure that the data that is coming into our systems is given by those who have both the power and the will to do so. As we move to a world where there are more active forms of data collection, and we begin to think about A/B testing or champion challenger models where some individuals might have access to a new system that improves their quality of life while others don't yet have access. We have to pay attention to the equality and fairness of how those systems are being deployed. we have to think also about how individuals have agency in the creation of their data and how they are able to be represented into the world around it. The current model, where data collectors often are the ones who have property rights over data, that they get to use them without acknowledgement or sharing economic benefits, can be supplanted, can be transformed by the idea of building data institutions. These are bodies that sit in the public sector, that serve to deliver the best interests of the people who are creating data, and serve as an intermediary between those data creators and the people who seek to use it. And the third primary focus that I think about in an ethical data sourced environment is how are we allowing those people who are creating data to benefit from the economic benefits that come from its use? When a company deploys an algorithm that maybe allows for automated driving or a better industrial process, they're deriving profit from that work, but that profit isn't yet being shared with the folks who delivered the data that allowed them to do it. So if we want to start talking about ethics by design in AI, I think we have to start first by making sure that we have a clean and conscience-free source of data that we use. And I think as a matter of policy and of public conversation, we need to examine and make sure that we're starting from the right place. Now, with those thoughts in mind, I know that we're here really to think about responsible AI. And so Kay, I'll come back to you. And I know that you're leading the field in thinking about better mechanisms of AI governance. Maybe you could take us on a little bit of exploration of how a well-structured, ethically sourced data universe sets us up for better AI. And maybe you could also share with us how your work is demonstrating these models for AI governance.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's also, as well as talking about data, it's also important that we don't, at a conference like this, forget that we need to take everybody with us on this journey with AI. And so one of the things that we think about often is there a better way than using AI to take people on a journey? Because we know that in many places, there isn't sufficiently good infrastructure. There isn't access to internet. There isn't access to computers to allow us to use AI. And so whilst I am the first person to be wanting to educate everybody using AI or provide healthcare to everybody using AI, we also have to bear in mind that in countries around the world, including here in the United States, children don't have access to internet, and children are at the moment camping out by McDonald's in order simply to get internet so they can do their homework. So coming to the actual work that we do, we have 14 different projects around operationalizing ethical principles, and we are doing them across 10 different jurisdictions, including my colleague Arunima, who works in India. And to give you some examples, we have been working for the last year on a project that we call responsible use of technology. It's important to think about how you frame that technology, whether you're using it in companies or whether you're using it in government. So what we know is that we need to retrain, educate and train our organizations in order to deploy ethical AI, ethically designed AI. We also know that we need to create organizational change so that people accept the use of artificial intelligence in and by their organizations. And we need to think about the design of the product so that from the moment it's a twinkle in the eye of an engineer through to the time that it's sold and beyond, we have to be making sure that we think about the ethical processes and bringing the right teams together to ensure that you create an ethically designed product. Only last week, MIT and BCG put out a report which said that actually 70% of AI applications are failing in companies at the moment because those companies don't have good internal training and haven't got that cultural change to allow AI to function and make the best use of both the data, which you've mentioned, and AI. You'll hear a little bit from Arunima, who, as I say, is on the panel, about our work with NITI, thinking about ethical frameworks for India, coming out of the wonderful chapter on ethics in the National AI Strategy for India. So I won't go into the detail on that, but I do feel, and I think it's been mentioned before, that we need to have a global view of what we're doing with ethically designed AI. And I accept Dr. Haji's comments that ethics is in the eye of the beholder, and that we have different ideas of ethics, but equally, as I say, there are those 10 common ones that come up all the time. So the World Economic Forum has just created the Global AI Action Alliance because of that need to have a global, coherent, and collaborative multi-stakeholder approach, bringing together governments, companies, academia, and nonprofits and foundations such as yours, Vilas, to really dig into how we create ethical design of AI. And I'm pleased to say that, big organizations like GPAY, OECD, UNESCO, and other major companies, universities, etc., have already joined that collaborative effort. I want to just quickly end on how I think that we have to work very closely thinking about how children are empowered by the use of AI, but also protected from it. There was a study just recently that said that AI can detect loneliness with a 94% accuracy. That's actually better than we can do. AI can be your best friend, but as your best friend, it can also be the most influential thing in your panoply of folks who influence you. So we need to make sure that we can educate children with AI, but also protect them from the potential manipulation that lies with the tool. So let's continue, Vilas, to talk about pragmatic action. With our projects at C4IR and others, we're demonstrating it's possible to build AI systems with ethical design. What do you think is necessary to build this work to scale, and who needs to participate in order to do so?
Yeah, thanks, Kay. I'm really appreciative of the stories you just shared with us, and particularly around the use of AI and how it intersects with children's growth, their creativity, their ability to socialize and to become fully formed adults. It puts into a very firm perspective the idea that the conversation we're having today isn't an academic one. It's not an intellectual one. It's one that has very real consequences. And your work also shows us, Kay, that AI ethics isn't something that we can simply assign as a task. We can't put it in a box, hand it to a designer, and say, make sure this AI you've designed is ethical. We really have to start from a holistic, a total society approach. It's not so surprising, right? As we move into a digital revolution, the idea that we should think about ethics, that we should think about the moral right, we should think about identity and how we want to shape ourselves should be the fundamental question that we think about. So where do we start? Well, as an institution that supports the public interest, we spend a lot of time thinking about the kinds of approaches that we might take to answer these questions. I'd like to share 3 with you today. The first is to take the idea of what kind of AI we're developing and start from a lens of the why behind it, the AI why, if you will. We need to have social conversations about what we're designing AI to do, rather than simply entrusting a few private sector companies to design those products. As we examine capital flows and the amount of money and capital going into developing specific projects, we're often struck by a question. How is it that society has a voice in the design of what those products are going to do? When we think about the agricultural sector, the educational sector, the kinds of work that needs to be done to bring entire nations along in a journey, we need a more robust public conversation. And so one of the things that we call for is better coordination, is for governments and academic institutions and the civil sector to really step forward and to take more ownership over a question of AI ethics. And as we're doing today, to bring those conversations into the public sphere. The second thing I would suggest is that we need to take the responsibility and accountability of AI ethics away from the creators of AI, and again, hand it to society at large to be able to come together to define some common standards. whether that's done at an international level, a national level, or somewhere even different. We need to be able to ask creators to follow norms that are set by our shared public interest, rather than allowing them to create products and simply seeking to understand how they might create harms or vulnerabilities. At the same time, I'm a firm believer that the potential of these technologies is incredible, and we're already seeing those effects in the world around us. And so one of the things that we additionally need to do is to build feedback loops, to understand that as we deploy AI products, we're also monitoring and watching how those products are being used by the ecosystem around us. And that we have ways for the voice of the customer, if you will, the voice of the beneficiary, the voice of the human at the end of the technology chain, to be able to come back and share how they have interacted with these technologies. Finally, we need to create new spaces. Kay, you mentioned a little bit of the international work that's happening at the OECD, the Global Partnership on AI, and at the World Economic Forum, and where that work is incredibly important in creating a shared sense of our shared humanity, of creating a baseline of the kind of ethical and moral principles on which we want to operate. I do also want to emphasize that it's necessary for countries to step forward and define their own value systems under which they want to operate, to know that there's a baseline of common dignity, but that there may be cultural interventions that allow us to implement AI technologies in different ways, and to allow that to happen across the world in a way that lets us then come back, revisit, and find those best practices that we want to bring forward. So with these three ideas in mind, and as we go into an incredible panel where people will talk about some of the specific work they're doing to deploy responsible AI, Kay, I want to just ask you one final question. I wonder if you could share with us, across your work, one of the very exciting uses of good AI governance that you've seen, and why you put such importance on it.
Yes, certainly. And just picking up a couple of the things that you mentioned, India led the way in making sure that they had a national AI strategy, which is so important, because if you don't have that chapter on ethics, then you can't start the conversation. We're working with New Zealand to have a public conversation around the use of AI by government. And so I fully endorse those things that you have been putting forward just now. But in terms of what I think that AI can do, we talk a lot about bias, and we have seen Gartner tell us that by 2022, 85% of our algorithms will be erroneous if we don't conquer the problems of bias in AI. But let's turn that on its head and say, if we do conquer the problems of bias in AI, then AI can lead us to a place where the discrimination and prejudices that we see in our own world at the moment can perhaps be lessened and maybe even go away. And what a great gift that would be, that AI could give us for our future well-being in countries and around the world, and our communications with one another. So Vilas, what's your vision of integrated social institutions in AI, as my last question for you?
Well, I will take your optimism, Kay, and I will continue it and lift it up. I do really believe that these technologies have a transformative effect, not just on our daily lives, but on our potential to augment our creativity, to augment our intellectual capacity, to make us better humans. What we may need along the way is a little bit of help. We can't put the responsibility for that transformation only in the hands of a few, or in the hands of individuals alone and unsupported. And so what I think we call for is the creation of new institutions, organizations that support educating us and helping us think through the issues around us, through which our voice can be amplified and seek to create regulations and policy, but also opportunity and transformation. And so I suppose where I will end this session is, as we think about the panel ahead and as we think about these issues, how do we create a world where we all as citizens take an informed view and really get into the debate, that we guide and nudge policy, not simply as an abstraction, but something because it is innate to our own experience and our own lived transformation. So thank you. And with that, I will hand it back to the organizers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vilas, and thank you, Kay, for putting all the issues with regard to responsible AI and how we design it with ethics in mind on the table. So the stage is set, the issues have been highlighted both by Dr. Haji and Vilas and Kay, and we can straight away go into the panel discussion. So I hand it over to Mr. Kundu for taking over the moderation and the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, and just brilliant to hear the first three speakers today. As you said, Mr. Singh, they've laid out a very broad range of issues that we all need to tackle. I will, however, suggest that we pick up on Mr. Dhar's last comment, that ultimately, if we leave this room in an hour, this virtual room in an hour, sharing a lot of the deep technical knowledge in this space, which I'm sure at least my co-panelists have, I might not, I think we'd have failed. I'm sure there are loads of conferences where we can all get deep into the technical piece. I'd like to make this panel discussion about stories that people who are not deep domain experts in this space can relate to. What is ethics in AI? Why does it matter? Are there other things that matter more than ethics in the use of AI in certain contexts, right? So that's something that I think I will want to try and push, and I'll start off because the introductions have been done. I'll start off with a story of my own. Because we are in India or virtually in India, I'd like to start with the Mahabharata, and within that the Gita. I am stealing a little bit from a Bollywood director's short film. It's a film that I'd really encourage everyone to go and watch. It's called Anukul. It's based on a short story by Satyajit Ray. In it, a humanoid robot is bought by an individual, and the robot learns about what it means to become a human. And where does he learn it from? He reads the Gita. For those of you who know what the Gita is, it is the ultimate treatise in how you embrace your dharma, the right thing that you need to do. And in one very important scene, the robot asks his human master, why does this blue man, the blue man being Krishna, why does the blue man ask Arjuna to kill his brothers? And the man explains that is, he's not asking him to kill his brothers. He's asking him to embrace his dharma, his responsibility. So the robot asks, but how does Arjuna know or Krishna know what is right or wrong? And the human master points to his heart and says, you know it from inside. And the story goes on with a rather shocking end. I won't give any spoilers, but ultimately the humanoid learns what they believe is right or wrong based on what the Gita tells them, to some rather disturbing effect, right? The reason I quote that story is because I think before we talk about how we build ethics by design, I think it's really important for us to perhaps demystify a bit. What exactly do we mean? And I'm thrilled that we have people with ethics in their job titles. I heard two of you now, one in a previous role and one now, Will. And I'd really like to get into that first. But perhaps before we get to technical discussions, perhaps if I could request each of our panelists to perhaps share a story of their own, either a personal story or something that really epitomizes why ethics in AI matters. Now I'm going to go in the order that I can see on my screen. So perhaps if I can start with you, Arunima, if you can just share from your perspective a slightly non-technical story of where you believe ethics matters in AI.
Yeah, thank you, Shameek. I'll start with a story about the use of AI in human resource functions and some of the ethical challenges that come up. So there has been an explosion in recent years of AI-based tools for human resource applications, including hiring, retaining talent, training, benefits, and employee satisfaction. And all these products, they have the potential to boost employee productivity, save HR departments time and money, and improve fairness and diversity outcomes. But at the same time, there have been several articles warning about the negative consequences of AI, pointing to its use in human resources as a key risk area. To list some of them, employment decisions have high stakes with critical consequences for individuals, organizations, and society. The concerns about AI algorithms encoding bias and discrimination are further complicated by labor and anti-discrimination laws. Errors in the adoption of AI-based HR products can also undermine employee trust, leading to lower productivity and job satisfaction. And finally, the unique aspects of the human resources setting, which includes small data sets, complex social interactions, and data privacy concerns, they all pose challenges to developing effective algorithms. So I'll touch upon a story which was reported in Reuters in 2018 about an AI recruiting tool that showed bias against women. The team had been building computer programs to review job applicants' resumes with the aim of automating the search for top talent. And the company's experimental hiring tool using AI to give job candidate scores ranging from 1 to 5 stars was started. But soon the company realized that its new system was not rating candidates for the software developer jobs and some of the technical posts in a gender neutral way. And this is because the company's computer models were trained to vet applications by observing patterns in resumes submitted to the company over a 10-year period. And most of these resumes came from men, a reflection of the male dominance across the technology industry. But the company was quick to identify the bias, try to remedy it, and finally they abolished that project, as was reported. So this strong gender imbalance could be in how the system was trained, and these training data biases might have arisen due to non-diverse data sets. So during the hiring process where people's careers are on the line, we need to be careful about how we use technology. This means that AI is a tool that gives us initial information and analysis to speed up the hiring process. A good system can provide you with the data you can't find yourself, or maybe you don't have the time to do so, but it should not be making the final hiring decisions. We as humans with our own intelligence must be the ones to select, reject, or hire other humans. And lastly, I would like to point towards a recent EU white paper on AI, which states that in light of its significance for individuals and addressing employment equality and diversity, the use of AI applications for recruitment processes, as well as in situations impacting the workers' rights, would always be considered as a high-risk application. So I would leave you with this story.
That was fascinating, but I'm not going to let you go that easily, if I may, Arunima. Just one follow-up question from that. You mentioned that the AI had that bias. Now, as a male in the technology industry myself, but also as a father of two girls, do you think a human making the decision would necessarily have been not biased?
So the bias could be in the human, in the data sets as well. I mean, there are multiple areas where bias creeps in, and there could be some preconceived notions, societal things which could have influenced the way these models were trained and the specifications were set up.
So perhaps we can hold that, and maybe if I can request you, Arunima, to take that away. Do we end up holding AI to a higher standard than all those recruiters and all those engineers who've been hiring male engineers who've been hiring male engineers in the past? Keep that thought with you while I move to a female engineer in Google. Fernanda, if I can request you to go with your story next, please.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. So I think one of the things I'd like to, that I was thinking, given the previous stories, right? It's the importance of thinking about whether or not we should be using AI in the first place in high stake decisions, right? And so one of the cases that became very, very famous a few years ago in the US was a ProPublica investigative reporting piece where they found out that in the US there were a number of jurisdictions that were using algorithms for deciding the criminal risk that that inmates may have in doing another crime again. And then they found that there was bias in terms of race. And that was obviously a major problem. It was a very serious situation. And one of the things that, so let's keep that in mind. There was a whole public debate about this. And in fact, being a researcher in this area, I can say that this also spanned a huge number of academic papers about this notion of machine learning fairness. How do you deal with bias in your data sets, in your algorithms? What do you do? And one of the things I think that is very helpful in dealing with these situations. One is what the previous speaker just said, is even if you decide that you're going to use algorithms to help you in high stake situations, you probably definitely want a human to make the final decision. The algorithm could help inform the human, but the final decision probably should rest with someone who is accountable for that decision going forward. And one of the things that the judges, and now going back to the story I was telling on ProPublica, one of the things that the judges were very much missing was that all they were given was a number. So the AI algorithm would go through all the data and would give a number. And the judges had no transparency behind what was taking into account for the system to come up with that number. Had they had been privy to that kind of information, maybe they would have different decisions, who knows? But this is the kind of thing you need to be asking yourself. I deeply believe in this. What level of transparency do we need, especially if we're going to be using these algorithms in high stake decisions? Chances are we want some level of transparency even in low stake decisions. But definitely in high stake decisions, I think this is one of the things we should be very much aiming for.
Thank you so much. That is indeed one of the most famous or infamous, as you might want to see it, examples. I think it is fascinating that there's been a huge amount of statistical and scientific work after that, even looking into the definitions of what is ethical, which brings me nicely on to you, Will. I know I've looked at your CV on LinkedIn, and I'm just impressed by how much you've done in this space. I will come to you later on in the panel to ask about kind of some kind of a conceptual framework, if there were one on thinking about AI. But perhaps again, if you could start, Will, with your own story around the concept of ethics in AI.
Sure. So first, I want to commend the Prime Minister Modi for convening this conference, and Mr. Singh, and specifically Arunima and Firth-Butterfield from the World Economic Forum, which I assume is how I got here. I'm always grateful, and I always come when they extend an invitation because I always learn more probably than I contribute. With that being said, the vision of our company at Hypergiant is delivering on the future we were promised, and that comes from our CEO. And the idea is that technology has been promised to us to create a better world, cleaner energy, a more habitable planet, better communications, less loneliness, more relationships between each other, more efficiency, less labor load, and just increasing the overall quality of life. In order for that to happen, ethics will be important. We happen to believe our perspective really comes from the point of view whether you study the Gita or the Quran or the Torah or the Holy Bible, or if you're an atheist or agnostic and you have your own set of values. We believe that the world will be better if you adhere to the highest and best ideals of your own values. So we're not asking you to adopt the principles of some other school of thought or some other value system, but we feel like the world would be better if you adhere to your own values. So our hope is as you deploy technology, you become more of your highest and your best self. And we feel like that's super important. Story is, I remember when I first got to Hypergiant, one of our earliest use cases was with a very large a Japanese company, and they're the largest provider of rail cars in the world. The project came to us to do a predictive maintenance combined with some robot process automation element to it. Initially, when our data scientists, network engineers, designers got to it, we came in R&D, they came up with a solution that would essentially decrease a tremendous amount of the workforce within the company, because the AI technology was there and robot process automation was there to make it more efficient. This was before we implemented our framework. I had just gotten here. But then when we took a look at, before the solution went back to the client, when we took a look at it, we realized that they supply the rail cars for the automated people movers at airports. They support subway and metro rail trains at large metropolitan areas, and that's around the world. And what we realized is that the reason why those rail and transportation infrastructure projects were funded, usually by voting by people in bonds in the first place, was as jobs programs. So if we turned around and offered a solution back to our clients that would decrease jobs, the impact would actually cause our customer to lose their end customers, because they couldn't go back and propose to the city of Chicago that we have a solution now that will eliminate jobs, when the only way they passed the transportation project was as a jobs program. So what we did, what that in turn required our engineers to go back to do, is be smarter and say, what are the human machine teaming apps that we can create for predictive maintenance? What are the human machine teaming apps that we can create for robotics? In the United States, and it's probably true around the world, but in the United States, the reason why Amazon gets so many tax rebates is because they agree to have X amount of jobs, even though there are full warehouses in Amazon that can operate fully with robots. But now you have machines who sit next to robots, and that's because of the jurisdictional requirements. And where I am in Austin, Tesla is moving their cyber truck factory production into our town. And they have the same requirements as the jobs program. I bring that up to say that it doesn't require you to change who you are, or to learn about so many other schools of thoughts, or so many other values. No one has to get a PhD in philosophy to execute values in ethics in AI. What you have to do is take your highest and best values for yourself, and if you're true to those, we're on our way. And when it comes down to use cases, you have to be expansive about your stakeholders. It's not just that your CEO, it's not just that customer that you have, but it's also everyone who will touch that product or that service or be touched by it. In a lot of cases, the entire world is your stakeholder. And once you do that, I think similar to the film that you referenced, it should touch your heart when you imagine the entire world as your stakeholder. And as it touches your heart, in some schools of thought, that's considered conscience. As it pricks your conscience, that in turn should lead you to make the right decisions. That's how we look at it.
That is just a wonderful way of putting it. I think if AI usage gets us to meet our own highest standard that we find, I think that's just brilliantly put. Perhaps moving to Professor Ravindran, perhaps moving a little bit from philosophy to the science, and I will come later, as you know, to a question around the mechanics of that. But again, perhaps starting off with an example or a story of your own, or one that touches you in terms of the ethics of AI.
Sure. So I had a significantly interdisciplinary center at IIT Madras on data science and AI. So we not only have engineers, we also have people from humanities as well as people from the biosciences and part of it. So just a story about one project that we started about 2 years back. Right. So we were looking at trying to build automated systems that can, get a sense of an estimate of the traffic density on the roads. Right. So this is on Indian roads. So if I train an AI system with videos that are largely gathered from the Western world, it's not going to recognize most of the objects on the Indian roads as actually vehicles even. Right. So you have all these various kinds of vehicles with different form factors going on the road. So we have to basically generate an Indian road vehicle data set. Right? And we worked with the city corporation. We got live feeds from the traffic cameras that were posted, and then we basically created this system that went from something like 55% accuracy in identifying traffic, the vehicle types on the road, to something like 98% accuracy on identifying vehicle types. We were really happy. Great. And then we said, hey, we should not house this data. Let us release the data to the public. Right? And then we were going to do that. But by this time, we had a significant involvement of people from biological sciences in the center. and they said, "Oh, you're talking about data releasing to the public. You should get it go through ethical clearances." And then we started looking at the data, and it turns out that there are a few frames in the data where the license plates of the vehicles are clearly visible. Okay? Now, this gave rise to a conundrum, right? So we never gathered this data with the end purpose of identifying the license plates, right? We were only looking to count how many two-wheelers were on the road, how many buses, and how many cars, and how many jeeps, and things like that, right? And suddenly we find that this data can be used for identifying vehicles on the road. And since this is a traffic camera data, there's a timestamp on the video, right? So basically, if this data had been released to the public domain as we were going to do it, so it's very likely that somebody could join it with the vehicle registration data and figure out who was on the road at what time. And so our ethics committee said the only way we can allow you to release the data is if you go back to the vehicle owners and get their permission. And they can release the data. So this is not something that was even there in our conscience, right? So one of the things which I would point out, I mean, this is an amazing session. In fact, when Kay and Vilas were going, I was happy to give up and patients. So we picked the medical sector, and we are actually, and of course, everything went for a toss once COVID came around. But we started this project pre-COVID on trying to understand people's perception of AI and what kind of reassurance mechanisms we need to put in place. And these are lines of work that we never thought that we would get into earlier. So there's a lot more that I can talk about along these lines, but I'll wait for you to come back to me with your discussions.
Thank you so much. Perhaps now on to you, Kesh. Keshav, please go ahead.
Thank you, Shameek. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, absolutely.
Good evening to all the fellow esteemed panelists and to all the participants. It's definitely a humbling moment to be here at RAISE, and huge congratulations to the government for pulling together such a mega event. Well, Shameek, I think the experience I would probably share is an organizational one, and I will use the example of Tay, the chatbot, and how it went wrong. And I think before Tay chatbot episode happened, we had Xiaoice as a chatbot in China, which used to talk to 40 million plus people, having all kinds of conversations, and we never saw a problem. But that was for China. And then we thought of, the developers just thought of, how about creating a similar chatbot success in a radically different cultural environment? And that's how the Tay chatbot was built and released. But within 24 hours of the chatbot being out in the public, we learned that a kind of a group of trolls had exposed a vulnerability by teaching the chatbot offensive and inflammatory language, and it was repeating constantly. And that failure, I think, was a turning point in our journey to understand the balance between risk-taking and continued innovation, and the kind of harm it can cause. So first of all, we of course took down the Tay chat bot immediately, and we deleted all the tweets. In fact, our head of research, Peter Lee, published a public apology, an explanation as to what happened. Satya Nadella, in fact, wrote to all the team behind Tay to, first of all, sharing that, take this as a learning experience, take this as a journey of evolving, thinking around how AI could go wrong. Also said it has to have empathy to the people who heard about the chatbot. But I think it taught us a lot about how do we think the potential ways in which an AI could be exploited, or the way in which AI could be manipulated, and the harm it can cause. So it was put to several levels of stress test. It made us learn a lot about the behavior. But the most important part was that, as I think our fellow speakers said, that AI can have very different implications and impact when you change the cultural setting of where that is being deployed. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind when we think of the responsible AI standards that we want to build. The implications could be far and wide. So I think that was a very profound moment for us as a company that made us really think about how AI could have impact on humans. And listen, we are only scratching the surface today in terms of both the impact but also the risk side of things that we still are working towards and continue to research, continue to understand, continue to learn. So that would be I think, a good example for me to share.
Thank you so much, Keshav. I was going to ask you about Tate doing that. I'm just going to pause a while for two things. One, just to take stock, and second, I think there's a few interesting questions that have already come up. But just for our audience, because it is always difficult to follow on the video, just to go back, we looked through a pretty broad range of examples. We looked at the effect of AI on gender justice, or just pure not getting job opportunities, never mind gender, it could have been some other factor as well. We looked at a potentially far more serious implication for particularly, I believe, Fernanda, for people of color who were disproportionately impacted by the US justice system related usage. We talked about the chatbot. We talked about actually very important part about AI ethics, which often gets ignored, which is, yes, it might be very ethical in its use, but it might kind of not it might take out the income that was meant to fund the use of that piece of software, or in this case, hardware in the first instance. And then we talked about how AI can also inadvertently lead to loss of privacy. That is just such a broad set. And as you just mentioned, we've just scratched the surface, right? So it's really fascinating that I think when we take these words like ethics or governance, tomorrow I have a session on governance, and we make it real, I think that's when these things start landing. We just go to a few of the questions before I now come to each of you one by one. I'll just read them out. I'll read the three questions together, and then I'll open it up to the panelists to try and answer. I think there's two different views. I think one question was, people don't blame AI as much as they blame the human when they're doing a task together. Do you have any insights on this asymmetry of blame allocation between man and machine? On the other hand, we had another individual asking us, holding AI to ethical standards close to humans is itself debatable. What if human standards are not up to the mark? How to weigh standards for ethical AI and humans? I mean, these are two different perspectives. The other question, which is also related, is how do you incorporate ethics in a robot? Probably follow the law of robotics stated by Sir Isaac Asimov in iRobot. Now, I think there's probably a common theme around this, which is when we say ethics, whose ethics? Who's to say that? Who's setting the standards on ethics? And obviously, this could go on for hours. But I don't know if anybody wants to volunteer. I will volunteer on one point to the individual who said, "How come we hold AI to a lesser standard than humans?" Trust me, as chief data officer of a bank globally, I am held accountable far more for what the data or the algorithm did compared to what the human did. As I said to Arunima, if a human, I mean, for the longest time, male engineers have been hiring male engineers. I don't think that got as much publicity until the recruitment algorithm from Amazon gave it so much. So I think actually the reverse is true. Often, at least when they're aware there is a machine behind it, machines do get held to a higher standard. But the question is, are they always aware? I don't know if anybody wants to pick this point up about, is it enough to hold it to a human standard? What if the human itself is not enough? So I don't know if anyone wants to raise their voice. Sorry, Fernanda, perhaps you go first, and then Professor.
Yeah, I think this question touches on one of the hardest questions on debates about AI ethics and things like machine learning fairness, which is these questions, even though there is a portion of that of the answer, I guess, that is technical, right? A lot of that answer needs to come from humans, and it needs to come from value systems. And so, in a sense, if you look historically, we've always been, as you know, as different societies, we've been kind of okay being ambiguous about what we mean when we talk about fairness or where we talk about justice. It might mean different things in different contexts or in different countries. And that is okay. There's a certain level of ambiguity that we are okay with. There's a certain level of regulation and laws that we are okay with. When you try to take all of that, again, which has its own level of ambiguity, and you try to figure that out on an AI algorithm, you are going to have to translate a very ambiguous set of values into very precise math. And that's where you start to have problems, because on the math part, you're going to have to decide. You're going to have to make some serious decisions. So one of the things that I think has been very interesting, and one of the things that I think the academic community in this space has been trying to do is to kind of say, look, yes, AI has these challenges, but let's not forget that we humans, we need to tell the AI what are the values or what are the trade-offs that we are okay with. And so, for instance, when you look at machine learning fairness algorithms, there are a number of different kinds of metrics for machine learning fairness. You can decide, let's say you are a bank and you're trying to decide who to give loans to, and you have different populations coming to your bank asking for loans. And you know that these are different populations with different characteristics and demographics. How do you decide to be fair to these different populations? There are a number of ways in which you can decide to be fair. The tricky part is that no matter which metric you decide, whether you decide, I'm going to be blind, you come to my bank and I don't care if you're, this race or this other race, or if you come from this place or this, I'm going to treat you all the same. That's what fairness means to me. Or if you were a different kind of bank who says, no, I care deeply about the fact that you're coming from a different part of town. I know that you come from a different demographic, and so I'm going to treat you differently in order to be fair. There are, again, multiple measures and definitions of fairness that you as a bank can decide to adopt.
Yep.
The tricky part, again, is that there is no perfect definition of fairness. And so there's not a single one that encapsulates everything else. And so the major point is that no matter how you decide to be fair, it's always going to be a trade-off. And again, then we go back to our values. And so it's never just a technical question, it's a societal question. And I feel like that dance is the hardest dance for some of these questions.
So what you're saying, I guess, is that before we can talk about AI being ethical or fair, we need to be able to define the parameters of, because there are so many different ways of defining fairness or ethics, even in the one context of a bank giving a loan or not giving. Absolutely. Professor Ravindran, you were going to say something as well.
Yeah. So I was actually going to go back to your earlier point, right? The one where you were talking about is AI held to a higher standard than humans, and is it fair to the AI, right? So I'm putting fair in quotes here. So that is a reason why we should hold AI to a higher standard than humans. I'll tell you, the first question is actually on the money, right? So we tend to accept machines as being non-emotional, rational, but it's kind of an inbuilt bias for us, right? So when we say the machine, there's an algorithm that ran and made this decision, humans tend to think of that as being more balanced, right? And therefore, if I'm going to have a machine spew out biased decisions, right, then I'm adding a little bit of the certainty bias that the society gives to the machine's decision, to the biased data already, right? So that is one part of it. The second part of it is machines are going to be biased consistently. If I'm going to build a biased AI, it's going to be biased consistently. Humans are variable, right? I mean, you sit on the desk and make decisions. Now you go away, another person comes and sits on the desk. Maybe he's not biased, or he's biased a different way, right? So that is, it wouldn't have such lasting and deeper impact as you would have when you have a biased AI system, right? So it's just basically institutionalizing the bias. So you have to hold AI to a higher standard.
Fascinating. Very, very, very true. I think on the point of machines being not being emotional, tell that to my laptop, though. I do feel sometimes when I've typed very hard on it, it does get very emotional and stops working for me. But but I do agree with you on a broader point. Absolutely. I think because the certainty, the permanence, if you will, of AI's lack of fairness can be much more damaging, because a human can't replace that. Absolutely. Perhaps now we move to our or what I had planned as the next set of questions. If I may come back to you, Will, I mean, given what we've just heard about how difficult ethics is, you must have an easy job being Chief Ethics Officer.
Well,
tell us a bit more. What does your job entail? I mean, I would love to see that job description. So please tell us a bit more.
So, turns out I have a good CEO, which is very helpful, in my job. So it is somewhat of it's complicated issues, but it's pretty much an easy process. What we try to do, in my background is primarily as an entrepreneur. Even though I went to law school, I didn't come into it as a lawyer. So I don't think about ethical issues like you would think about compliance, which is a set of checklists implementing laws, rules, or policies. The way we think about it, and we try to talk in the same language as the engineers, the data scientists, and the R&D team. So we think of it in terms of use cases, so AI use cases. We think of it in terms of workflow. Where in the workflow will we do the ethical vetting? And then we think of it in terms of our processes, whether it's Agile, whether it's a Scrum. We think of it in engineering terms, the way that the technology is actually built. So in our company, it pretty much goes like this. The client or the customer or our partner has a technical problem. Mm-hmm. Our R&D team, our engineers, data scientists then come up with a bunch of solutions to that technical problem. So that's so first step in the workflow, technical problem or business problem. Second step in the workflow is come up with a menu of solutions. Now, before we take our solutions back to the client, we go to the next step, which is ethical vetting. So then we vet each one of those potential solutions based on our framework, which I'll talk about in a second, based on our framework. So before we even send our solutions back to the client, we've already vetted them based on our standards. So that gets back to what I said. It allows us to be more ourselves. So it keeps us from going into a situation where one client is the Department of Defense, one client is the Joint Artificial Intelligence Command, one client is based in Japan, one client is based in India. It doesn't matter what their values are. They're going to pick from a set of solutions that we've already vetted on our values. So now, and it's embedded in the workflow, so nobody can skip it. So what we learned from the case study I told you earlier is that if you skip it, you can bomb the company and you can bomb the customer, because you're going to go send them back a solution that says you don't understand their business or customers at all. Once that became clear that we almost made that mistake, it then became mandated that ethical vetting become part of the workflow. So to that extent, in the last year plus, it's been easy to get that part done. So now, how is the vetting? What's our framework? Mm-hmm. First step is, in ours, is based on Immanuel Kant. It's a deontological framework, which is based on our duty to the world, irrespective of what's going on in the world. So it's a 3-step process. The first step is the law of goodwill. Is there a positive intent for this use case? That has to be answered first, and that's the use case owner. The second step is the categorical imperative, which is a maxim, which says that if everyone in our company, every company in our industry, every industry in the world use technology in this way, what would the world look like? So then that maxim requires us to make the entire world our stakeholder. And then step 3 is the law of humanity. Are people being used as a means to an end, or is this technology designed to benefit people? The use case owner has to make, and that's usually a team of people working on the project, they have to make an affirmative case around all of those areas. Now, we have other people in the company who aren't attached to that use case, and we call those people the red team. So people who work in cybersecurity or you work in military, you're very familiar with red team. So the red team goes along those same 3 sets of core values. They look at what the project owner said about why they were ethically justified, and then they come in with objections to those defenses. So on goodwill and positive intent, they talk about things, why this could be misconstrued, and if it became public, why this isn't goodwill. It goes to the categorical imperative. It brings up stakeholders that will be impacted that you didn't think about. harms that could happen that you didn't think about because you were in a rush to get the project out of the door, or you wanted to satisfy the client, or you had ego reasons for wanting to deploy new tech. So the red team then brings up all those objections. That what would the world look like? And then step 3, on the law of humanity, then the red team brings up more objections because they say, no, this is about profits. This is about efficiency. Here are how people will be negatively impacted. So once that happens, those objections go back to the use case owner. And then those objections have to be answered, or the use case or the technical solutions have to be modified. So once that happens, that entire file then goes to our ethics review board. And then the ethics review board either says they accept this use case and these justifications, reject it, or they table it. And then that entire file is kept in an archive. We have a kind of a decision workflow, ethical decision workflow tool for this, in an archive to keep it in. So that other people, if you have use cases like robot process automation, or you have facial recognition, computer vision, you can go in and search and see how the decisions were made at our company and the ethical justifications that will be used. Now, does that mean you have ethically pure solutions? Well, we live in the real world and we have complicated clients in very challenging environments. So we don't think of it as ethically pure, but what we do think of is they're ethically reasoned, and they can be justified and they can be defended. And by making our engineers and R&D team and data scientists go through this process, then it lightens up the ethicists in them, and it makes them more creative. And when they become more creative, the solutions become more robust. And as the solution becomes more robust, then the engineers and the technical side, they see the benefit of adding this into the workflow. So that's the way we approach it.
That's really helpful, Will. A very, very practical 3-step structure. One quick last question for you before we move on to you, Fernanda. How does your CEO have your annual review with you? What does success in your job mean? Or is it just the absence of a big blow up is success?
Well, right now I'm killing it, so in the first year is awesome. Like, my first project was the one I described, which was, at the time, it was our largest customer. And it's global. So in that particular use case, because their trains are literally everywhere, they're touching tens of millions of people on a daily basis. And so when I came in with the framework, and it was just before they sent the solutions back to the client. And when I came in and I explained, well, if you don't care about your client losing contracts in Chicago, in London, in New York, in California, if you don't care about that, if you don't have any problem with that, then you guys can go ahead and send that back. And then once they realized that, man, this is a jobs program, and it had whole other kind of factors in there too. Like when you deal with public municipalities and entities, there are also diversity requirements that need to be met. There are a whole lot of other sensitivities. So once that happened, then they realized the value, and now it's in every use case. And so we went from being able to go back to like 3 and 4 solutions for each technical problem to now 10 and 12. Because it actually has made them more creative, because they're thinking broader about stakeholders, and it's increased our relationships with the clients. And the one word that I always use that I'm surprised I haven't talked about yet is it increases the trust between us and our clients, and us and our partners. And once that trust is developed, and it comes a lot of reasons, but one is that if you think so passionately and you care so much about the world, then our client understands that they're part of the world, which means you must care about me and care about my outcomes. And it's strengthened our relationship. So far, my reviews have been
very good. Excellent, yeah. Excellent. Coming on to Fernanda, I see that your focus is on improving human-AI interaction and on this very important point of democratizing AI technology. And on embedding societal expectations into the design and evaluation of AI systems. Tell us a little bit more about how you do that. It sounds fascinating, very close to my heart personally, and I'm sure of many of the panelists here.
Sure. So I think one of the things that is just historically true, is that this technology, as widespread as it is today, it definitely comes from the field of computer science, and it's complex. It's complex technology, lots of math, lots of computation. So it has historically meant that very few people have, one, access to it, but two, really know what it means to even build one of these systems, or how do you understand whether the system is working well, what are the problems, what are the implications of the system. And so in my team, I co-lead the PAIR initiative at Google, which stands for People Plus AI Research. We start from the idea that someone said something like this before today. You should not need a PhD in order to get a sense of how this technology works. You should not need a PhD to probe a system. And you should not need a PhD to understand if the system is biased or if it's going to have some awful negative implication, which is great, but how do we get there? So one of the things that my team does is we build a number of tools that are code-free. So you don't need to be an engineer, you don't need to know how to program. And we build these tools to allow more stakeholders, non-technical stakeholders, to, again, audit and probe these systems. How is this working the way I want it to work? How does it work for different populations? How does it work for different facets of my data set? Is it biased in different ways? And so we create these tools. A lot of times these tools are data visualization tools. They have a lot of capabilities. And one of the things that I think is very important, we create tools that we use internally at Google. And once they become useful at Google for product teams at Google, we open source them. Because again, we're all in this together. I think we really need to raise the level of, one, AI literacy, and two, access. Again, the number of people who need to be able to, poke at these systems needs to be broader. And so this is on the side of democratizing. There's another thing our team does, which is, so my own background is in data visualization. And so I'm very biased that way. I think data visualization is awesome and we can understand so much about data. So we realized early on, we created a very small simulation and data visualization that we put on the web about exactly that scenario I was talking about before. Imagine you were a bank and you were trying to be fair to different populations. And so we have a little simulation that you can play with. It's all visualized. It's all abstract data, but you get an intuition very quickly about the fact that there is, again, no perfect solution and everything is a set of trade-offs. So we put this online and we started seeing it go viral. And we started seeing the discussions online about this and people saying, oh, wow, I always thought that whatever, demographic parity, which is one fairness metric, was the way to go. But now I see that equal opportunity, another fairness measure, is much better. Whatever it is, the point is not which measure you decide on. The point is to, again, understand that whatever you do, it's going to be a set of trade-offs. So we did that. And we started getting emails from a number of places. Some of the emails we got were from criminal justice departments in the US saying, hey, we saw you created this visualization for like a bank scenario. We use algorithms in our department. Do you think we could build something like this so that stakeholders in our criminal justice department can better understand what the implications are for their algorithms? And my answer to that was yes, I think you can do this kind of thing. So again, how can we think creatively about empowering people who, again, are not engineers, but who should be informed and should be thinking critically about this kind of technology. And I truly believe that the more stakeholders we bring to the fold, the better off the technology is going to be, very much along the lines of what Will was saying. When you start thinking about these implications, the technology itself becomes more robust. So it's good for everybody in the end. And so this is a lot of what our team does. And then the final thing, and I'll stop, is we put out a set of industry guidelines. And this was it was purposefully not designed for engineers. It was designed for UXers, so user experience designers and managers who are designing and shipping AI-enabled products, and who have to think very concretely about things like, is my system fair? How do I explain my system to my end user, even though I don't even know everything that's happening in my system because it's an AI system? So how do we give concrete ideas for teams who may not have a will in their team, who may not have an entire team of people thinking about these questions? How do we give them the tools and even the questions that they should be asking themselves as they do that work?
Fascinating, and I'm a big believer in data visualization myself. I put crap at it myself, by the way. That's why I really like when people are able to do that. But talking of tools, Professor, if I can come to you, ultimately, you do need the science underneath to make sure that it's not just something we find after the event, but we're almost building it into the design. How far has the science got there, or is it still an art form, or is the science getting there in terms of starting to build some of these parameters into the design?
Yeah, so science is making progress. In fact, today or somewhere like maybe tomorrow is a deadline for one of the conferences that's focused on fairness in AI, fairness, accountability, and trust in AI. So there's a lot of work that's actually being put out in that space, right? But I would still say that in terms of trying to build these notions of fairness into it, a priori, we are still at an infancy. This exactly goes back to what Dada was saying earlier, right? We are trying to take really fuzzy notions and trying to make them mathematically more concrete, right? And we are, I mean, if humans are not even good at articulating what they would accept as a fair system, right? So when these notions themselves are so fuzzy, in fact, I like to use an example.
Maybe if I may just clarify. So
sure.
You're saying it is more difficult to articulate the objective than to engineer the objective once articulated. Did I get that right?
If you are able to articulate it at a level of consistency and accuracy, right, then it could potentially, but still study that MIT did a while back, right? You know about the people talk about a wagon coming along a rail, and they can throw a switch, and then you can get it to move to. So they did a version of it with cars and pedestrians, right? So now the question is, they ask people with different scenarios, right? You are driving a car, and there is suddenly a pedestrian on the road, and your car, I mean, you are not able to brake it. You basically have to run it on a divider, right? I mean, do you do that, or do you hit the pedestrian? And now the answer is going to vary depending on whether you have a baby on board with you, whether the pedestrian is old or young, and so on and so forth, right? And when they did this across different societies, they actually found very different answers. Right? It turned out that some of the Asian societies were more respectful of the elderly, and they were not happy, but they were, they preferred to, cause harm to children as opposed to older people, right? And it was actually reversed in some of the European societies. I mean, this is really a hard question to answer, right? I mean, you have to either harm one or the other population. It turned out that depending on where you come from, right, the way you would answer this question actually was very different. Right? And so when even such fundamental things as which life you value more, there's so much variations. Right? So now the question becomes, how would you incorporate this? Okay, let's put that thing aside for a minute, right? How are you going to get it from the humans? If I can give you a very formal characterization of what is fair, right? Can you, or what is ethical, right? Can you encode it into your learning algorithm? We are making progress there. But I personally feel some of the notions of fairness we have managed to encode are rather simple, straightforward, and perhaps naive. We have not been able to get into really nuanced versions of it. Maybe Fernanda can add a little bit more to that in terms of how nuanced things can become, right? But right now, I still feel we have a long way to go before we have the mathematical tools for doing that. In fact, we probably have to look at a different set of fundamental ideas, right? Things that come from, say, causal reasoning and and integrating more formal logical representations as opposed to just statistical correlations that most of machine learning and AI now relies on. Right? I think that is something that we really need to mine a lot more before we can build this. And just one other thing, we're talking about structures that we need to put in place. I'd like to mention one thing that we have done at our center. So after our initial experiences, now we have actually have a full-time, right now it's a part-time ethical consultant. So no project is approved from our center unless we have the ethical clearance from the Institute Ethical Board. But even before we take it to the ethical board, we have our faculty and researchers can sit down with the ethics consultant and make sure that they have a sound design, experiment design before they go on. And this is, I think we are the only reasonable lab in India that even has this from the AI point of view. I mean, academic, of course. I'm not talking about the industry, but at least from the academic point of view. And I think we need to bring about this kind of a cultural change, like a mindset change in people, saying that, hey, you have to worry about it from day one, not after you finish running your experiments. And there are algorithmic solutions for it, but I think there's also a human factor to it, and the way we design the whole ecosystem should change.
Absolutely. Keshav, just moving to you briefly and talking about how organizations are viewing it. One of the things that strikes me, and my apologies in advance, Fernanda, for talking up Microsoft slightly on this, but at least from a public perception perspective, it almost appears Microsoft is going out of its way to say, actually, we'll almost use fairness and ethics in the use of data and AI as a way to distinguish ourselves. I don't mean that as a negative point, but I mean, is that actually just like you have corporate social responsibility, looking at environmental impact, etc.? Is that a way to make, frankly, to distinguish yourself in the market? I don't mean this in a negative way, but I'm just saying, is that a positive in your view? Does that constitute an unmet customer need that we as corporations should be aiming for?
Thanks, Shameek, for asking that. First of all, for us, responsible AI is not just words, we are living through it. And I would, since it's an organizational story, I will just use a very small number of slides to just show what kind of journey we have been and what made us, where we are today in terms of our own and learning. So, and I want to also reflect to the question which I think Anika asked about, can you hold humans to the same standard, hold machines to the same standard as humans? And I think it's very important that as computers, we empower computers to take decisions on behalf of humans, as we call it, augmenting human capability. And computers are more and more behaving like humans, like the parity that we spoke about. It is absolutely important to think about that we would want to hold ourselves to the highest standards, and we need to think of the same ethical standards for the computation side of things. And for Microsoft, it is the core principle that while we consider AI has tremendous potential, we have equal realization and acknowledgement that it has risks as well. Because we believe that if an AI solution is not designed responsibly, that may not have it may not develop into a good product, and it may not impact. It may have all kinds of different impacts as well. But our story started with this book, which many of you would have heard about in 2016, is the Future Computing, where we first time wrote a book, not a paper, not a blog. It was about artificial intelligence and its role in the society. Where we examined several scenarios, we examined several application cases, and went to that journey about what are the principles that should govern, right? And the one question that we asked, I think, which really touched me and I think many around the world, was the question is not what computers can do, but what should do. And that's the debatable part of as to the holding computation capabilities and computers and AI solutions to that standard, that we should decide on what they should be doing, not just the sheer potential of what they can do. But our journey, the progression that we made from those 2016 when we came up with these 6 principles about fairness, security and privacy, reliability and safety, inclusivity, and then the foundation principles behind responsible AI is that transparency as well as accountability. Then we had Ether committee was set up inside Microsoft, which is a committee which governs the assessment of all the sensitive use cases which come across to Microsoft through customers, partners, and they are able to work across partners in engineering to understand the implications and then come up with recommendations. We followed up by the establishment of Office of Responsible AI, which was, I think, a unique initiative inside Microsoft to bring the right set of policies, processes, and implementation models, plus also public policy advocacy to bring about the right set of discussion and right set of legislations and regulatory discussions. And that followed up with our call for regulation to protect rights. And that also was quite, I would say, a moving time where a technology company was asking for regulation of technology, because we understood facial recognition could have all kinds of benefits, but we felt that just self-regulation in this area is not sufficient. The government must think of regulating it so all companies can have the same standard. And then, of course, the AI business school we launched for business leaders who may not be technocrats, who may not understand the technology fully. They are business leaders. They're thinking of customers and the growth of the business. They need to understand not only the applications, but what are the ethical issues that may come to them when they think of deploying. And of course, the tools and practices that are continuing to evolve. So for us, from principles to the practice, it continues to be a journey. And I would say, the session is about ethics by design. These design considerations are core to how Microsoft thinks about these principles to practices journey. And I'm, of course, not going to elaborate on these 6 areas. You all have good knowledge of them. But I just want to highlight, I think Dr. Ravindran mentioned the cultural aspect. And I would say the people aspect of the design considerations have been a profound impact on the way we have been deploying and developing a responsible AI. One is that we have responsible champs around the company, around the world, who are not only driving awareness, because it doesn't matter if you're not an engineer, you need to know about what does responsible AI mean. Then they're also developing a culture of responsible innovation. What does it mean to innovate responsibly, and not just have a caution to the wind and you innovating to the level you just want to experiment the limits of technology? Then we have mandatory responsible AI training for every single employee in the company. Everyone must have that training so they understand the principles and why that commitment is not just principles, but it is actually in practice in our solutions. Engineering teams are undergoing tremendous amount of pilots to understand what insights, what learning are they having. Engineers today are not working developers and data scientists. They have anthropologists assigned to them. They have liberal arts people. They have linguists, and they have people with accessibility needs who are assigned to them. And we have social scientists and human rights experts. Now you have to bring that level of commitment to enable engineers and data scientists to understand the social implications of AI. And that is where I think our design considerations are quite deep. And we believe that we need to have those toolkits for engineers to not only understand the behaviors, model behaviors, but how do you translate that model behavior for customers to understand and partners to understand. So I think it has been a journey. And even we added these principles, we believe that we have to make a start. We cannot be perfect. We have to learn. But even the discrimination against facial recognition was. So I think I just want to end with this slide that we are thinking beyond just the responsibility of AI, but also how AI can do. So, and that's where I think our journey continues to evolve, and we are keeping a growth mindset in our approach to responsible AI. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This coming to you, Arunima. I mean, you've heard Microsoft speak just now, and we've heard other. Sorry. Hello. We've heard Microsoft, we've heard Google, you've heard me from Standard Chartered, Hypergiant speak. It's great for corporations to talk about self-regulating, but there are those who will always say you also need a framework of policies and regulations. And I understand the WEF is doing some work in that space. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about that before we move to one slightly controversial question that I want to ask the group.
Yeah, sure, Shameek. So while we have, I think Professor Ravindran and Fernanda, they all spoke about some of the technical means of implementing ethics in AI applications. So I would now like to share some thoughts around the role of policy in implementing ethics in AI applications. So these are the regulatory means of embedding ethics into AI. So along with the technical means to ensure ethical AI decision-making processes, it is necessary that we also consider some of the policy-making instruments that are available. So AI systems, they're all constructed by and programmed by and used by humans and organizations. So unless the people and the organizations who are responsible for programming them and using them are committed to ethical standards for personal reasons, they will only program and use the AI systems in an ethically aligned manner if they are forced to do so by some binding legal rules, or if they believe that a corresponding ethically aligned system design is economically or in some other ways beneficial to them. So to make sure that the AI systems behave according to ethical principles, it is therefore very necessary that you adopt a variety of governance mechanisms. So coming to the policy instruments that are available, so it is important to be aware that there are several policy making instruments that can be considered, and it as an alternative or in addition to legislation for implementing ethical considerations into AI applications. So there are various forms of regulatory instruments. They can range from tools from hard law responses, for example, statutory legislations and regulations, rules, fines, and subsidies, to some of the very softer options such as creating awareness in education, partnerships, consultations, etc. And question that is much debated is whether to regulate and how much to regulate that's been a question that's debated, and there are several points of view to that. So it is often difficult to respond to technical developments with regulatory mechanisms very quickly enough to keep up with the pace of technology. And also, at times, legislation is perceived as having a negative impact on innovation, and at times might disadvantage domestic businesses in relation to businesses in less regulated countries. And in addition, in view of the territorial limitations, laws only bind people within respective national states. So,
Mhm.
but at the same time, I mean, if you look at the other side of it, legislation can bring about new incentives to innovate as companies compete to adopt compliant technologies and business models.
Yep.
For example, with regard to data protection, efficient legislation can actually be considered as a competitive advantage and incentivize businesses to develop innovative privacy by design solutions, or maybe transfer the registered offices to countries which are assuring a high level of data protection. And we've also seen that customers might like the fact that businesses are subject to certain binding statutory regulations and accordingly prefer services which are rendered by such companies. So the variety of possible policy-making instruments, they underline that ethical concerns are not necessarily best addressed by legislation or international conventions, but depending on the ethical concern at hand, there are alternative regulatory measures that might be preferable. So a balanced governance approach is therefore needed to be taken into account. From here,
Thank you.
I have a few,
Sorry, please
yeah,
go on.
yeah. From here, I
Yeah,
would
please.
like to reiterate the need for creating a sustainable culture of AI ethics, I think, which has been spoken by many of the panelists today. So defining and embedding AI ethics skills is about behavioral changes within a wide group of people in the company. There is a need to work with executives to ensure that ethics is part of their board's governance and leadership agendas. Governance structures are created to minimize ethical failures, KPIs and metrics are defined. Uh, Internal ethics boards, self-assessment guides, and external audits have emerged as key mechanisms for private sector enforcement. And as Dr. Ravindran mentioned, internal review boards have also come up as structures available for academia to enforce ethics in AI. So finally, to illustrate all of this, I would like to just touch upon about one of the AI and ethics projects in the forum that we are currently running in India. So the World Economic Forum is working with Niti Aayog to build an overarching ethics framework for the design, development, and deployment of AI in India across all sectors and all use cases. And we are also working on operationalizing mechanisms of implementing the AI principles in the public, private, and academic sector. So NITI Aayog has developed the approach to responsible AI for all, and the draft paper has been released by NITI Aayog for wide public consultations. Many of the esteemed panelists have also contributed to some of these conversations. The principles in the working document have been developed on the basis of the fundamental rights that are afforded to Indian citizens as per its constitution. And I will leave you with some of the questions that we are currently trying to address as we are working through this draft document. We are trying to evaluate the kind of regulatory framework that might work for India, bearing in mind that for some sectors like health, finance, there already exist regulators who may be positioned as the natural choice for discharging functions by extending the regulatory ambit in this area as well. We are also debating on the degree of enforcement required for the adherence to the defined principles. Do we just need high-level principles, or should we be regulating specific applications and specific use cases? And the enforcement mechanisms are actually evolving at various levels. There are cases where standards could work, some places where guidelines could work, and places where legislation could work. So drawing the line between self-certification and regulation is one of the key questions we are discussing with various experts in India and as well as globally. And a risk-based stratification of AI use cases, which is suggestive of different degrees of enforcement of principles, has started emerging as one of the most favored lines of action. So I will just pause there with the current discussions ongoing in framing the responsible AI approach for the country.
So I look forward to that. I think we here in Singapore and some other countries, we've also had equivalents of that. So really look forward to how that applies to a country as complex as India. I'm going to finish off with something slightly intentionally provocative. I'll request you to not necessarily believe that I believe in what I'm just saying, but I'm going to put forward a proposition. I'd like a minute from each of you, no more than a minute, which is actually talking about responsible and ethical AI is so much a first world problem. When AI is needed to solve critical problems like a cure to COVID-19 or environmental degradation or poverty or just mass vaccination or so many other things, and it's not just AI, it's using data and AI together. Can we actually afford it, at least in the developing world, in countries outside those areas where perhaps the human development goals have been met? I just love to get your thoughts on this. It is intentionally provocative, but the motion is actually talk of AI ethics is a luxury. We should just focus on using it for common human benefit at the human development goals level. Who wants to go first? Maybe Fernanda, let me open it up for you first.
Sure. No, I think it may sound like a first world problem, but I think when you come down and understand more about it, it's not a first world problem. And part of it is that some of the problems that tend to be bundled in questions of ethics, again, are things about bias and fairness. And those kinds of problems tend to pop up everywhere in the world, and even more so in places in the world that don't tend to be well represented in large data sets. So for instance, you can think about this from a number of perspectives. You can think about languages. So when we think about Google Translate, right? Well, there are lots of different languages on the web that we have access to documents. And then there are some languages that have much fewer documents. And so that technology is probably not going to work as well for languages when you have a scarcity of data, right? And so you want to be careful about that. And then, we keep thinking about, oh, is it a gender thing? Is it a race thing? Fairness and bias can
impact every aspect.
They impact every aspect. So when you deal with health, for instance, there was a question on diabetic retinopathy, which is a project Google did in part in India. And one of the things that we had to be very careful there about fairness, about bias in the data set, is the size of the human pupil. So we had to make sure that the data set was very well represented for very small sizes and for very large sizes. And the other thing we had to be very careful about was the level of the image resolution, because different labs and different clinics have very, so again, this is going to pop up everywhere. And
so your proposition, if I may summarize, Fernanda, is for AI to work for the greatest good of humanity. It's actually not a luxury. It's something essential because of data. I'll come to Professor Ravindran. I'm sorry for rushing everyone. Please, my apologies in advance because I know we are close to the door. Professor Ravindran, your thoughts. I know you've spoken about this in the past.
Yeah, so actually our opening remarks today, our first speaker actually brought this up. So we are literally heading back where we started. And so I agree with Fernanda to some extent. So your question was not entirely honest in the sense that the dilemma that you spoke about is not just for AI. Suppose I develop a serum for COVID-19. That will work only, I mean, that doesn't work for people, who have curly hair. Are you going to hold it back, saying that,
exactly,
or between you and me, it'll work only on people who actually have a head full of hair, right? And so I are left out of that category of people. Are you going to hold it back? You're not, right? So why blame AI for these kinds of really moral questions, right? So when you're talking about ethics of AI, I think it is more mundane stuff like bank loans and things like that. So I mean, there are issues that are going to come up, and where I think we need to worry about the ethical issues and fairness in AI as well. And it's not just a first world problem, and it's going to crop up everywhere.
Indeed. Will, your thoughts?
I think from the beginning of time, from the Tigris-Euphrates River and the Indus River Valley, the Nile River Valley, the Ganges River Basin, all of civilization has depended upon the social compact between human beings and the trust within each other. And civilization has been made possible because we can exchange goods in a way that makes it possible for us to survive, and that's based on trust between each other. So when it comes to technology, the reason why I feel like this is an app title and hashtag that you have for the conference, which is AI for all, even if AI is not developed by all, designed by all, profits aren't reached by all, the impacts are on all. And so similar to nuclear weapons, even if your country doesn't have nuclear weapons, you have a total interest in the way that technology is regulated and deployed. And AI is a similar apex technology with the impact on every human being on the face of the earth. So it's not a first world problem. I think it's a problem that needs to be grappled with for everyone, but people in the first world have a unique responsibility of seeing the rest of the world as their stakeholders that they're responsible for. And going back to the roots of the beginning of civilization, that we have duties and obligations to, and we have to deploy the technology in an ethical way and maintain and build that trust to deliver on the world that we all want to live in.
Thank you, Will. Arunima and Keshav, very quickly from yourselves, your responses. The motion is well and truly defeated already, I'm afraid. But anyway, you can put the nail into the coffin.
Right. I will just sum it up probably in a couple of lines that I feel. I mean, ethics by design, making ethical consideration a part of the process of developing new applications. It is required at all times and at all places and cannot be an afterthought. And ethics in AI is needed to build public trust in such applications and for people to adopt them. So I think it is a must in all scenarios.
Thank you, Arunima. And Keshav, last word from you before I summarize.
Well, I think we are already biased when we say first world. There's no first world, and there's no second world. There's no third world. I think even the developed is also under question. So I think again, there's a battle of how our own biases creates different types of perceptions. So I think it's not the question. The answer would be no, actually, to that question, Shameek. And I think because we need a wide array of human experiences. We have issues which are global in nature. Like, the whole environmental issues, the social issues, the human rights issues are global in nature. And without having those diverse perspectives and experiences, the technology cannot learn enough. It will become more biased if it is only limited to a certain number of data or certain number of information around it. So I think we would definitely need a whole global experience to build AI to benefit the world and the opportunities around it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very big thank you to the panelists. I've just learned so much. Thank you so much to the panelists, Mr. Singh, and to the Government of India for organizing this. My key takeaways are absolutely AI ethics matters, and I did ask for your apology, ask for your, humor, and ask you to humor me on this topic. Obviously, my motion was not meant to be carried. Absolutely, it matters across. I took away the fact that actually the problem is not so much, at least yet, the technology, but it's actually the articulation of what is ethical. Before we can talk about ethical AI, we need to really be able to distill out what that ethics means in individual contexts, and then engineering it might be easy. And not to forget Fernanda's point, I think it is as important to make it, I mean, this is my personal passion, is it is so important to make it accessible to everybody. It is not about the experts in the room knowing whether AI is ethical or not. You should not have to be a PhD in philosophy or computer science in order to know whether the use of AI is ethical or not. Over to you, Mr. Singh.
Thank you, Shameek, and I must congratulate you. This was one of the best moderated panel discussions that we have seen in this summit. We have had stellar panels, but the way you conducted it, the way you involved everyone, and the way the discussions around ethics by design and responsible AI was put forward, it couldn't have been done better. So big thank you to all, and to all the panelists. We have come to the end of this panel, but I felt like this is so engaging that one can go back and review the recording of this and get so many insights. So all of you were fabulous. I convey my thanks for all the panelists for joining this, especially Dr. Haji and Mr. Vilas, Dhar, Ms. K, who delivered the keynotes and set the stage for this stellar panel discussion. So thank you, Mr. Will Griffin, Dr. Ravindran, Keshav Dhakar, Ms. Fernanda Vegas, and Arunima Sarkar. It was absolutely breathtaking, the whole conversation. And thank you, Shameek, for doing such a great job. So thanks again. And we look forward to more exciting sessions tomorrow. We have the closing at 7, but before that, we have several other sessions. Most welcome to join. And I would just like to mention that Mr. Wala Afsar is joining as a keynote speaker in the closing function, which will be at the same time, 7 to 8:30 p.m. in Indian time tomorrow. So do tune in, and we look forward to being in touch with you. The recording of this will be available on the portal, and we'll be sharing with you the links also. Thanks again for joining this panel.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.